This episode is brought to you by MeUndies. While MeUndies can't totally help your love life this Valentine's Day, they can offer you insanely comfy undies and loungewear to buy or gift. MeUndies has so many awesome Valentine's Day prints and styles. Plus, you can match with your partner, friends, or even your pets. This Valentine's Day, give the gift that'll keep them thinking of you and score huge site-wide savings at MeUndies.com/Spotify. That's MeUndies.com/Spotify. MeUndies. Comfort from the outside in.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The new year brings new health goals and wealth goals. Protecting your identity is an important step. LifeLock monitors millions of data points per second. If your identity is stolen, LifeLock's restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Resolve to make identity health and wealth part of your New Year's goals with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, Oklahoma Christian University political scientist Trey Orndorff.
Thanks for having me on the show twice in a row. I guess I didn't offend you too badly on the main show.
No, it was weird because when I was getting ready to do the intro, when I'm with Jay, I say defender of freedom, Jay Carson. I wanted to say Oklahoma Christian University political scientist. Trey, no, a big kind of build up, but it's like this isn't like an MMA fight or anything like this. Weighing in at 187 pounds, and anyway. So, but. It is good to have you.
You're my new hype man. That's what it is. That's what it is.
There you go. But yeah, I'm glad we get to do this. We don't that often. And like I said, with everything that's been going on in the last week, it's just so hard to keep track. I've been reading so many executive orders. It just because I'm an original source person, so I like to read those source documents. And there's just a lot to get through, and so much we didn't get through just because we didn't have the time on the main show over the weekend. And so I thought we could start by talking about one of the areas we didn't get to, and that is the executive actions on DEI type issues. Because, when Donald Trump isn't talking about the immigrant invasion, there's, I'd say, a good chance he's talking about some kind of DEI thing. And he wasted very little time in acting here. I mean, one of those actions, of course, was that making it a policy of the United States to recognize just two sexes, male and female, and that order also required that all federal agencies remove anything that inculcates gender ideology. It also required that the Attorney General issue new guidance to correct what the Trump administration sees as the Biden administration's misapplication of Supreme Court's ruling in Bostock versus Clayton County. This is back in 2020. And that dealt with Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which prohibits employment discrimination because of sex. Now, in that case, 6 members of the Supreme Court said, well, that includes homosexuality or transgender status. And the Biden administration said, well, if that's the interpretation for Article 7 or Title VII, that must be the interpretation for Title IX or any place else that sex is mentioned. Trump administration clearly disagrees with that. But, it occurred to me, Trey, that even though Bostock was decided less than 5 years ago, the current court, it's a different court from that court. I mean, of that 6-member majority that reached that decision, only 4 are still here today. You got Chief Justice Roberts and then Sotomayor, Kagan, and Gorsuch. All 3 of the dissenters, Thomas, Alito, Kavanaugh, they're still on the bench. Now, Justice Barrett, she's been, I'd say to me, a pleasant surprise, probably a disappointment to Donald Trump in many cases. But if we count her as a possible or even likely addition to the dissenters, this should work its way up there. And Justice Jackson's in the majority. We're at 5-4 to, still, I think, on the right side. But it's really hard to say, and I'm not comfortable with it. But I'm curious what you think about this action in particular and this whole idea that discrimination based on sex doesn't include homosexuality or transgender status, at least according to the Trump administration interpretation under this.
I mean, just a little question. It's not a big deal. No, this is actually, I think, a complicated one. And it's something that Ken and I have talked about. And because of him, I've had to look at this more. The original idea behind the Civil Rights Acts, I think probably would not have included homosexuality or transgendered rights. And that's something that, Ken and I have talked about on the show. But the court holds it in that way, I think, in large part because that's the expanding definition of what that means. But now we come to the question of, how would a modern court, and that's in itself a tricky conversation, as you rightfully note, 5 years later, what a court might look at like on that front. I think especially given that, again, and you had mentioned Barrett, Barrett and Roberts both seem to be careful in not upending the established order too rapidly, too quickly, whatever they may or may not think about the details of the case. And so that, it's one of those, it's half of one, half dozen the other. I don't know. I think that probably the most likely outcome is that the court ends up applying the logic to the other titles. I wouldn't put a bunch of money on it, but that's where I would stand.
It's weird because on this issue, I find myself so torn because I absolutely agree that people should not be discriminated against based on their transgender status or whether or not they're homosexual, heterosexual, whatever their definition is, right? But
it's not in the Civil Rights Act.
This is my problem, is that for me, being intellectually consistent here means that if I don't want the other side reading things into the law or into the Constitution that weren't intended to advance their policy goals, well, then I can't do that on my own side. And I think the way you put it, I guess I'll put it slightly different ways. If you went back when this was passed and you asked almost any of those legislators who passed that, do you mean for this also to apply to transgendered people or homosexual people? First off, they'd say, what's transgender at that point, right? But I find it vanishingly difficult to believe that was at all their intent. And so to me, this is reading something into the act that's not there. I would be the first one to vote for an amendment to the Civil Rights Act to specifically include homosexuality and transgender status, but I just don't think it's there. And so it puts me in that weird position of feeling like I agree a bit more with the dissenters on this than I do with the majority, even though my policy preferences are very different from that.
And on the policy side, right? I mean, the other problem here, and I think the reason that the Biden administration wanted to put it in is I think if you had a vote right now, I think it would lose.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't think you'd get all the Democrats. I do not think you'd get all the Democrats on board even. And that is also in and of itself a problem because that is the issue. We finished the last show talking about the power of the court to be maybe one of the last true institutional checks. The downside of that is that oftentimes the court ends up being the policy arbiter for these kinds of issues. And whether they ought to or not, it is inescapable that this is what happens to them. And therefore, they are not operating in a vacuum. And so they're going to look at these things and say, well, what happens on the basis of how we rule? And that is less than ideal, let us say.
I guess that this whole idea that, well, if a fair interpretation of the law or the Constitution does not support what we want, then we're okay with an unfair interpretation of it. I don't know. That rubs me the wrong way. It reminds me, I was watching, because I watch a lot of football this time of year, of course. And, that whole thing with Patrick Mahomes almost going out of bounds and then stopping and then doing this massive flap. Now, we didn't get the flag for that, but that sort of thing just burns me up. And that's for a game that doesn't have nearly the significance that this sort of thing has. And I feel like if we just abandon these basic principles for short-term expediency, what we end up with is what we're seeing is basically a race to the bottom, with each side saying, well, if they're going to play dirty and cheat and do this, we can't unilaterally disarm. So, you bring a knife to the fight. We'll bring a gun. They bring a gun. We'll bring a freaking howitzer. And hey, let's just kill each other. And this is where we're at. And I just think it's
We'll go back to I love our Discord group. Go back to our Discord group. And you were pointing something out on this. And, we're on the bonus show. We can talk about that. So we're in the supporters exclusive, right? Oftentimes, some of those arguments boil down to, well, last time your side fill in the blank. And then the response is, yeah, but before that, your side fill in the blank. and it's this never ending chain of, fill in the blank of these kinds of atrocities. But if you back up for 2 seconds, and again, I'm more of a presidency scholar than I am a court scholar, but the absolute same principle applies. The problem is that our institutions are such that they are designed to operate in part via precedents. And so if you set bad precedent for good reason, you actually are corrupting and destroying the essence of the institution, and it will eventually come back to be terrible. It's the same thing with presidents, right? Oh, well, the president has to do blank because of A. And you say, well, wait a second, though. Do you want everybody to be able to do A? Are you sure about that? And I think we oftentimes forget that in the partisan one-upmanship of, well, Clinton started with, and George W. did. And I think that plays out here for courts as well.
Absolutely. On to the substance of the policy thing. What do you think about this idea that the United States that it's policy to recognize just two sexes?
Oh, goodness.
Not that I'm going to put you on the spot, but answer me now, Trey.
No, it's not.
Come on, man.
So here's a couple of the problems. One, I don't know how carefully you've read the order. One, just empirically, I work with some really phenomenal, biologists and hard science scientists, right? And we talk about these kinds of things. This order is terrible on biology, right? Yep. I mean, let us start with the fact that it talks about your sex at conception. So let's just get some facts out here for everybody, right? And I'm a conservative dude, right? I'm a conservative Christian dude, but let's just be honest about how biology works. You don't exactly have a sex or what you might consider the gonads at conception. That takes approximately 6 weeks. And during that period, all embryos actually develop what we would think of as being female characteristics until in approximately week 6, week 7, you begin to have, if you're XY, you start to potentially have the expression of that chromosome. Now I say potentially because there are other factors. So one possibility here is the order itself talks about at conception, and that makes no sense. There's no biological sense to that. The other possibility, and I can hear May bringing this up, Mike, is, well, it's chromosomes. Well, the answer is that doesn't happen until week 6 or 7. And again, it is not the sole determining factor of your expressive sex at birth. And it also ignores the empirical reality that there are more than just basic XYXX chromosome human beings. And so even if we're talking about chromosomal, I don't really understand the order, right? So even if I wanted to agree with it, the order itself is just biologically problematic because it doesn't account for this. And that is even before we get to the fact that some individuals can in fact present with both sexes as a result of a combination either of chromosomes or because there are other kinds of hormones that also go along with that expression that can result in XXXY expressing the opposite direction. And so even if so when you say the sex that's expressed, this executive order is deeply confusing because it is more confusing now to understand what we might mean by sex on the basis of this order. Okay, so what if I come out and I have, male genitalia, which is apparently part of what they're trying to get at here, but I don't in fact have what you consider to be the standard male chromosome from, let's even be generous and say by fertilization, he means, during the process of development. And what am I supposed to be classified as? So I have just a lot of biological problems even before we get to some of the policy problems present themselves as a result of the bad biology going on here.
We hope you enjoyed this preview of our supporters exclusive midweek show. If you'd like to hear the rest of the episode, we hope you'll consider becoming a supporter. Supporters get ad-free access to all of our shows, membership in our Politics Guys Discord group where you can join in on the conversation, and other benefits at different levels of support. To become a supporter, go to patreon.com/politicsguys. You can also support us through Venmo or @politicsguys or through PayPal. You'll find all of our support links in the show notes as well as at politicsguys.com/support. And if you'd like to get the midweek show, but you're not in a position to become a financial supporter, that's not a problem. Just send me an email at mike@politicsguys.com and I'll be happy to get that set up for you.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,